it feels like a punch to the guts, right? When your relationship has ended, you are in deep, deep grief. The last thing on your mind, the last thing you could possibly think about would be meeting somebody else and starting over. And there is your ex-partner doing just that. And so your mind races going, how could they? Like, how could they be with somebody else? Like, did the last 10, 20, 30 years just mean nothing at all? We feel like we've been erased. Like, you know, they've just wiped us out of their lives, out of their story, and our brains scramble, you know, what did all of this mean? You know, was my relationship real? Was our life real? There's that sickening sense that, you know, we could easily be replaced like that. How does that happen? Well, there's lots of reasons it happens, lots and lots of reasons. And I want to talk to you about them, and I want to talk to you about how you kind of cope if this is happening for you. So the first thing is that sometimes when people leave our lives, they have been checked out for years, up to 2 years in some cases, where people have become dissatisfied and unhappy, and gradually over time they've become less emotionally invested. So by the time they tell you that they're going, they've left you long before that. They just haven't left the actual building. And so when they leave, they're all ready to move on. They're ready to start their new life. You know, they're prepped for it. Some of them will have planned, unfortunately, to have somebody in the wings when they leave because they knew that they were going to leave. If you're the person who's been left behind, you know, it's painful. Maybe you didn't agree with them leaving. Maybe you did. Maybe you both got to a space of going, God, this is a bit kind of, you know, we're good friends, but that's about all we are these days. But you still weren't ready for them to move on so quickly. Even if you didn't want the relationship, you needed time to grieve the relationship. So while you're trying to cope and you're dealing with a pen, you've got all this other stuff going on where they've moved forward. Some people leap into new relationships because they feel guilty, or they're lonely, or they don't want to be accountable for their behaviour. Some people do it because they just actually don't want to be by themselves. They want to be in a relationship. Some people do it because they're bored with their lives and they're bored with themselves, and a new person sparks energy and life into them again. You know, that's not a great plan, by the way, because ultimately, you know, relationships can't stay in that really exciting stage for a long time. But if you've been in a relationship for decades, it gets stale, and you know, somebody who's going to spark a light and make them feel special again is somebody that they're going to hook onto, rather than dealing with what went on for us and why didn't we try and work on it and get things better and come together instead of pull apart. So there's lots of reasons why people will move on quickly. You know, sometimes they want a distraction. Sometimes they don't want to deal with the fact that they are in midlife and they're bored of themselves and bored of their lives. And so getting a distraction can feel really, really good. You know, it can really hit us hard depending on this thing called attachment, you know, the way that we learned to bond and connect with people. And if we have an anxious attachment style, this can really open up a lot of old wounds about not being good enough, or not being worthy enough, or not being picked, you know, maybe being too much or too needy. And, you know, you're not just sort of grieving the relationship. This stuff that's happened, they're leaving, has activated all sort of abandonment issues for you from your past. And that's why, you know, the hurt is deeper than it probably should be, because it's touching more than just what's happening in this moment. It's bringing up a lot of old stuff for you too. I want you to understand something. When a partner leaves you, whatever they do after that is not about your value and worth. It's not about whether you're good enough, worthy enough, lovable enough. It's got nothing to do with that. It's about their stuff. It's about where they're at and what they're doing with their life. It's not a reflection on us. You know, it doesn't tell us what kind of a partner we were or we were not when they move on. It does tell us how they cope with their discomfort, how they cope with endings and new beginnings. You know, a fast rebound is not proof of how replaceable we are. It simply reflects so many other things about what the other person is going through and what they're willing to endure. You know, they're willing to do the emotional work to actually work on whatever it was that prompted them to leave in the first place.